Hello everyone, today a brief introduction to the ancient Indo-European heroes equestrian mythology that we will approach mostly through the symbolism of the horse itself in essentially pre-Christian representation, in part not only. This video is part of, say, a broader research on the origins of European knighthood, and it should be understood exactly in the sort of background to the medieval knight in a Western and thus Christian sense, and understanding the depth, the extent of the depth of the equestrian symbolism in ancient Europe. Right, many of you have asked me, at least over the years, among those that were more interested in medieval knighthood, when was knighthood, chivalry born, whatever, and there is this essentially very modernistic approach of saying, well, it's just about the 12th century, it's about the chivalric ideals because they began to write this down, but before it did not exist, right? Except, the entire identity of these peoples revolved exclusively since the Indo-European origins of millennia before around the hero on horseback, right? The entire iconography, like among even peoples that normally did not even fight in as nomads anymore, and had also very scarce amount of cavalry in some parts of Central Europe, all revolves around the equestrian hero. And we could extend this easily. We'll do it. We've seen it during the migration era, the early Middle Ages, and beyond, right? So today we just talk about a little actually pretty wide temporally and spatially context of the pre-Christian Europe and the Mediterranean, but not against that. That at some point with Christianization, unfortunately, we have the disappearance of the panoplies in the Herkerhet, in the sepulchres. In part, this leaves on the grave slabs that, as you know, are also throughout the entire Middle Ages one of the most overwhelmingly preeminent sources for the reconstruction of, in fact, that era's arms and armor, right? But especially the migration era witnesses this early sort of disappearance of the burial panoply in a time that is seminal for the development of that more strictly feudal type of cavalry that fundamentally starts emerging from this point, fundamentally the second half of the 6th century AD. The only true feudal culture existed in Europe by that point had been the Macedonian one, the ancient Macedonian, the one of Philip II of Alexander III. And this is also true before these great rulers that, as we will see, however, would push this further, if anything, because the same Alexander, the same Megas conquered the world on Bucephalus' back. You can argue. We made lots of videos about the Thessalian cavalry. I have something coming actually about properly Macedonian heavies and the various say tactical specialties, say subspecialties of that main function. And this is relevant because we know, in fact, that not just, in fact, in the migration era is the moment in which great part of that original steppe culture that the Europeans had always treasured the memory of in all their mythologies, right? From Rome to the Norse, etc., you always see that the hero is exclusively a horseman, right? This is I made a video recently about the veritable equestrian quasi-obsession that the Romans had, also in times in which they were reducing their cavalry numerically, but not qualitatively, to a bare minimum. Actually, Roman cavalry was of excellent quality, and we tend to always forget this aspect and saying, no, but there were other peoples that used the numeri or whatever. No, the Romans had ultra excellent cavalry, and they had this enormous care for always having this in their bodyguards and beyond. But we also witness the connection, in fact, that had existed before the migration era with this ancestral past throughout the previous centuries, like the ones after the Indo-European sedentarization in Europe, right? So, to make the long story short, it's important to look at the figure of the horse in the funeral stele in these previous centuries, because as you see also in Roman burials, of course mostly of knights, but also in many other imperial monuments, you have the recurring equestrian figure, right? And when you analyze also how the Roman Empire Christianized and the Christians began to fully embrace the imperial ideology, also from a secular point of view, they began to elaborate further on their own in the great, again, medieval tradition on such equestrian symbolism. And there is one aspect that we touched on different occasions, that is the sort of contrast, the counterposition, if anything, between the Uranian, celestial, heavenly, imperial dimension and the telluric, chthonic, terrestrial, earthly one, which, as we know from the videos that we made on the Imperial Catholic tradition, are unavoidably intertwined, indissolubly interconnected, just as in the doctrine of the two natures. I made an entire video about this fundamental doctrine in the Imperial Catholic tradition that, as you well know, predates Christianity, and that, in fact, Christianity was just existing, in, let's say, being born in the wake of, as any other religion at the time. And for all, again, the supposed biblical exegesists that are out there on YouTube, series on the gospel, like, everybody seems to miss this elementary datum about comparative religious history for some incredible reason that basically invalidates any kind of other discussion when not, in fact, brought up properly, like with this awareness. That speaks, in fact, of a perennial dimension, the divine one, that is immutable, right? It is perfect, and a fallen one that is basically just like the projection of increasingly degenerating images of the higher nature, in which humanity lives just before further degenerating and ultimately ever more collapsing, with the hope, of course, of divine success, of transfiguration, not simply of resurrection, but of actual divine achievement, that, in fact, the empire, as the Holy Ghost, the Nika, the Victoria, the Filcia, the, essentially transfigured soul of the lower nature that lives within us, right, into the angelic women, the winged glory that once possessed through self-sacrifice in holy combat will save ourselves, essentially, through God's grace, and bring us to heaven, like reconnecting to the one in the heavenly dimension. This is essentially what every single people at the time believed, except, of course, those, you can't even say except even those that existed in the more chthonic lower dimension, because those were always in conflict at the end of the day with the aristocracy, those who actually shepherded the same subjects, because without this internal tension you cannot strengthen the bonds, you can recompact the community to the point of going back to the one. So essentially, like, the pre-Indo-European peoples were more attached to these chthonic cults. They had grown simply more contemplative. you need action and contemplation in the Imperial Catholic tradition to fully compenetrate. You can't really succeed simply with one. Like when you read Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, for example, he makes this mistake stating that the Apollonian and the Dionysian are sort of categorically separated dimension, and that you can try the Dionysian because at the end of the day the Apollonian is always the same. It's kind of boring, at these levels. When of course there was a in the actual Imperial Catholic tradition a corporative hierarchy by which of course the heavenly dimension was above, the earthly one below, but it's this order that is able to transfigure also the lower element, and you actually cannot access the heavenly dimension without having passed through the lower one. Hence the sacred brotherhoods of warriors, initiatic rites. We've seen it many times. The horse was crucial in this because the horse is both a Uranian and a chthonic animal, right? He embodies the sort of the most celestial, right? Think about the Pegasus, like the winged horse that literally lifts the knight to heaven, like in his glorious cavalcade on Earth, but that in fact does stem from Earth. It's an incredibly bulky, beefy, bloody, right, animal that springs out of, like, probably of the earth, of the sea. Think about, in fact, the genesis of Pegasus from Poseidon's seas, and so the most chthonic of deities in the pre-Indo-European Pelasgian background of the Hellenic, the Dorian mythology. So this is sort of the background, the context in which you have to understand such symbology, because the horse itself was a symbol of victory, and the same Christians later would adopt this in their, think about St. George and the Dragon, in the sacred knighthood that had always been exclusively founded throughout all this time without any change, also through any Christian times. The Christians never did anything against this. Nobody could have ever done it. The Christians were not anti-militarists, they were not pacifists. We made tons of videos explaining how they constantly backed the entire sort of imperial military and the Catholic tradition accordingly. I will not explain the theological premises of Christianity either, but it's always the same Catholic religion that existed since millennia. Now, today we'll also talk just about Europe. We'll maybe talk about the Sasanians for a while, because we will also slightly go in post-Christian times at a point, but we'll just make different mythological and archaeological references to warm up, like for more developed videos. For example, today we will not talk too much about the horse in the Germanic tradition or the Roman tradition per se. We'll make references. I also included many pictures of that. I will rather look at the Danubian area, the Celtic world, the same Hellenic one, and more, so to show from the steppes to Celtiberia how this cult of the equestrian hero is a pan-European, a pan-Indo-European belief, central, of course, to the doctrine of transfiguration. It would be, in fact, a mistake to consider the horse merely a sort of chthonic element, which was an issue connected with. That's why I started with the sort of the disappearance of the burial panoplies during the evangelization of Europe, because of course that change was specifically wanted by the new Christian sensitivity to stress practically the irrelevance of any determined sort of material element that could not substitute the necessary spiritual absolute required in order to rekindle with God. Right? So anything that was a deterministic superstition, like I will just add a bit more of swords, like into the panoply of this dead, so that he will better participate in the fight against the forces of evil in the end time is, in fact, a very chthonic telluric distortion of what had been the Catholic tradition. Remember that just the fact that somebody was burying their supposed heroes was, of course, incompatible with the original Indo-European belief that, of course, heroes were to be at least cremated, right? And that there was something specifically sacred in the Indo-European fire, preparing something about Vesta that could not tolerate, in fact, like this more chthonic dimension, because at least the hero was meant to, with a blaze, like literally go to heaven, transfigured in the flesh, right? And this is also where Christianity, and again, any other Catholic tradition gets it, at least when Christianity was only Catholic. Then, of course, what happens from the 16th century AD, like, it's another ugly story, but I will, in fact, there is no need to digress on it today. What is relevant here, thus, is the fact that, as we all know, and as you can see, for example, in the pictures I normally upload in many videos about the migration-era warfare, Germanic warfare, etc., it was a common practice at the time among the Germanic establishment that ruled over Romance Europe to still bury their horses, right? And so there is a false equivalence that some modern scholar drew by saying essentially the horse is just a chthonic symbolism, because look, they buried it into the grave with a warrior, and so everything that pertained to that material dimension, the earthly chthonic element, was old. First of all, this is incorrect, especially considering that Christianity stresses the necessity of course, of transfiguration in the flesh, and that ultimately, going back to the one, entails that practically any element of the universe to go back to that state of perfection. It's rather like saying, let's not distract ourselves about what actually matters the most. Let's be concrete about the fact that it's not by burying weapons with a man that will fundamentally do anything, which is sort of a very enlightened concept. There is equally the counter-altar to this that you see, in fact, also among the previous populations. That is, okay, but given that the entire world will have to transcend, since our hero here has apparently not entirely transcended, because if anything there is a corpse to bury, we will sort of hope that the next true greater hero that will essentially transfigure the world on the basis also of the achievements of these other knights. Essentially, think about the Kurgans, like just looking at properly the spring of that knightly tradition, especially during the migration era for the reinvigoration of the same West, will do, and so there is really nothing wrong in doing so. So Christianity, Buddhism, etc., take sort of different stance in a more absolutistic way against that sort of purely spiritual capacity necessary to transcend the same materiality. At that point, like having a sword close to your corpse will not have really changed more than much in the end time. I made a specific video on this on the Aristocratic that you can find quite easily in my Migration Era Warfare playlist, especially. This has nothing to do with what the equestrian, the equine symbol really is, right? The Christians themselves did not equate the horse to the simple, okay, this is a sort of chthonic beast of sort, like the worst of all, the snake. On the contrary, the knight crushes the snake throughout all the Catholic tradition. And yes, those Gnostic spin-offs about the serpents actually being the good guy, it's a pile of BS under any Indo-European Aryan point of view, and I will make other videos to explain why that is the case. Why, of course, there is an ultimate symbolism in that too, but it's not the flipped version of the story, which is just a dualistic heresy, and that doesn't make any sense from a theological point of view, especially for how like a real Indo-European knight thought he could really save himself. always through God's grace, but being part, in fact, of this broader consonance that existed within his soul with the universe and with God. Other side of the story. Consider also this aspect I was hinting at before, that by the Common Era, which is also another reason why, in hindsight, Christianity emerged when it did under Augustus, or at least Christ was born at that point to fulfill the evangelical mission in this specific world. All these peoples, like, this is not just the Romans, but the same is true for the Norse, for around. Yes, they had some ideas still that here and there you find them in some text, even in Beowulf you find it kind of, but it's very timid, like the idea that a hero can escape his own destiny by some degree. Like, it's more like, yes, once you can do it, but the doom is sort of already booked for you. There is no way you can save yourself. So basically, this is the same raison d'etre of Christianity, right? The idea that God sacrifices his own son in that way to prove that even from the lowest of the conditions you can take over the world. Because if you're not willing to make that sacrifice, you're not able to understand the absolute level of annihilation that you must essentially defy, because it's just a product of your own sin, right? So always remember this, that also in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you'll find certain biblical exegetists today simply saying, no, God vindicated Christ, right? Because of what the Pharisees did, etc. This is technically not true. Christ saved himself, right? And the fact that God saved himself too is the same thing, right? It happens at the same time. It's in the purest Imperial Catholic tradition that the value of works is reflected by God's grace, right? And that's why all these peoples had actually already lost that original sense of dominance that the purest Indo-European spring, and also one of other traditions, as we've seen here and there, had initially acknowledged. So going back to the horse, because this is, believe me, very pertinent. I'm famous for my very long introductions, but at the end of the day, this is needed, because if you don't really know what I'm talking about, like you've never heard of this stuff before, as it often happens, especially people who don't like to hear, I don't know, that Rome or Christianity were good because, you know, they live in post-traditional nationalistic and or socialistic realities, and they don't even understand that anymore, is the only and actual history of religion of mankind. Like, there are no other version. If you are into other versions, basically you're into not having studied history of religion, right? Or not even having ever heard about what that actually is. And no, it's not just by listening to any other thing. And even me, to a degree, because I'm the only person who I think articulates this currently, at least on the internet. I'm sure there is somebody out there that knows the deal, because it's actually, like, you know, there are books that are also pretty famous on this topic. But also in that case, it's not like they have ever been popularized in a comprehensive sub that is even taking seriously the fact that people have no idea about this thing. Unfortunately, we live in an age of lesser people, so this is not really a surprise, unfortunately. And so what I'm even doing here, you could ask, but, you know, we try, because apparently that's also the only way you can go back to the thing, at least starting to do so. And when you look at the entire tradition of equine symbolism, you realize that before Christianity, the horse's association is with a very strongly positive component, inherent to the same symbol. The horse serves to heroize the deceased, effecting their apotheosis. Right? This is the ultimate point. And again, it's metaphorically meant to be so, but it's difficult again to separate it from how these men actually lived and died, because they rightfully observed that, of course, the level of professionalism and of athleticism and all the psychophysical values needed to tame a war horse and knowing how to fight and live in a world from which you literally dominate from the top of your war horse requires some superhuman capacities that the average person does not have, the average infantryman does not have, and that makes, in fact, the rider, the hero that is closer to God in his superiority. This is also very important when you realize that, as we were saying before, in sedentary Europe, while infantry is actually the so-called queen of battles, all these peoples still, again, maintain that the true hero is a cavalryman, in any case. Right, so the notion that also the Greeks or the Romans would allegedly have some sort of 20th century civic political mindset and style that is about foretators and so equality of people. This is absolutely yet another thing that does not find any evidence whatsoever in the entire concept of citizenship. That is an elect, chosen people with the divine mandate of conquering the world in arms, lording over all the other peoples. This is what is sung in the Aeneid. What it's the entire Augustan, Virgilian doctrine is based on this. That is, of course, quite straightforwardly the same Indo-European one, and it's based on the apotheosis of the leader, of the divine medium, right? That receives from God the same imperium that allows the chosen people of God to rule over all the other people and transfiguring them through the redemption that they will have to show by following the leader that will inspire them to do so, right? So, needless to say, in that case, it was Rome, and Rome is the only, again, power in the world that ever achieved that, to begin with, restoring a sort of golden age during Augustus, under which, like in a Christian perspective, the same Christ was born, just like the fabulous Apollo that Virgil sings of, and that again the tradition of all these peoples were awaiting in order to regenerate the world to this new offspring, divine offspring that would mold. Like Alexander, that was the other major step before that also Rome followed and completely fulfilled, was really believed also at the time. And the entire, again, symbolism is not just about the horse, but this very specific ideas. We've seen this in the video about, for example, the Macedonian blazons, right, in the Hellenistic era, symbolism, etc., like the globe, the sun, the unity, like people believe that the Sol Invictus was just like an Eastern thing that they brought from faraway places. It was Mithras. It's like the East, it's not like that's first of all straightforwardly Indo-European, but few people know that the Sol Invictus concept is to be found even in, archaic Sabine, right? It is actually belonging to all of these peoples through the symbolisms that we know, but through the very actual names of undefeated sun that we find even that archaically, well at the time of archaic Rome, and hardly doing with this sort of allogen, strange religion that came from the East and the spread, say, in the 3rd century, but it was already around before, actually, in fact, in the continuity of the same. Why? Again, today I cite Nietzsche twice, but he was the idiot who believed that Mithras was an Eastern, Levantine, squalid, anti-European thing. That also tells you, like, the degree of cultural inferiority that contemporary, say, intellectuals that we tend to quote without even knowing, like, tradition with capital T really says. Now, in ancient Hellenic Roman culture, the horse was not an animal reserved for labor or exclusive to the ruling establishment, but rather was associated with war, hunting, that were to a degree the same thing, as well as with sacred gymnastic games, right? And if you picture this, it's already evident. This is the Helleno-Roman culture, again, the alleged one that cares about the average person being equal to another in your, Marxistic, structuralistic nonsense you have been fed by universities. These were rigidly aristocratic, patriarchal, virile, and imperially Catholic peoples that considered, again, their status of divine kind to conquer the entirety of the world in this very specific superiority and inferiority of races. Even among these peoples, that again, like also the Celts, that had a veritable obsession, way more than the Romans, for horses, even though they actually didn't have the great cavalry that, again, the Celtic fanboys essentially made up on the internet in the last decades, without any, in fact, historiographical evidence, also updated scholarship. The Germans, any people in Europe that was fighting prevalently on foot, believed that the horse was a sacred animal, right? That that belonged exclusively to the elite, right? If you're not elite, you're pure filth, and as such, you must be subordinated to the elite. This is the news for lesser people today that think that on Twitter that now they can inform themselves through Twitter posts, right? That's the clearest and purest identification of filth in the truly human sense, which means dirty, as you know, in Latin. These peoples that molded the world in their own image, Alexander, Rome, believed, of course, in the absolute value of beauty, of culture, of power, essentially of superhuman qualities that had to allow them to lord over a world that they had to dictatorially conquer, organize, and wash away of its own sins. Also, and especially to a degree, with blood. And successfully so, because we're actually the direct result as a civilization that has not further crumbled in spite of the ever feebler individual capacity, but still in a collective sense, salvaging the possible. We descend from these world makers. I made a video about the cosmic centrality of Rome in the history of mankind that explains partly this, and I have a series incoming on that to begin with. But this sense that the horse was truly like the emblem of an aristocratic lifestyle, of the preeminence over the lesser, was, of course, all one with the privileged activity of the purest elite. The actual conquest, war, right? And war really meant primarily in a spiritual sense, meaning that who wins in war, of course, is inherently superior, because you cannot win in a war without the Holy Ghost that God bestows on you as the golden winged glory, beautifully celebrated in the same triumph, in that image of divinity, of the rising sun eternally rising, right on, as the king of the living in this space between humans and gods that is in theory in between, as the guy who rises as properly the rising sun. And then all what comes with the purest elite culture, that is to say, hunting, being a person who controls other people. Think about the Roman establishment. Like, even when you were a kid, you were habituated just to manage slaves, to tell them what to do, to teach them how to obey, to punish them, to dispose of masses of people for molding the world in your own image. The same goes for the Hippica Gymnasia, so literally the equestrian games that were essentially a parallel to like later tournaments in antiquity, and very well, in fact, practiced and sort of culturally emphasized by these, again, peoples that, like the Romans and the Greeks, fought mainly as infantrymen, but of course in the ruling, dominating elite, celebrated their own equestrianship. and inherent superiority stemming from that. The Iliad attributes epithets such as Hippos and Hippota to major heroes, meaning that the Indo-European hero is fundamentally a war horse rider and tamer, right? The hero's horse and the chariot, right? So controlling multiple horses at a time, are burned on his own pyre, right? So he literally gets transfigured in the Apotheosis, all one with the horses and the chariot of heavenly glory, like carrying him to the Imperium. This is true as well for the Thracian and Celtic warriors, right? They also buried, and not just them, of course, their heroes with the chariots. This is true again in many traditions. It was true in the Italic one. Even if we don't have, for example, the Germanic one is again less less documented, but we have, of course, pretty clear indicators that the hero in all these cultures was proceeding like on a chariot. If you look at the symbolism of Hellenic coins, of ancient, like of the Etruscan heroes, of everywhere, you find it even on later on developed in the same way across centuries and centuries. Look at Marcus Aurelius at the Antoninus Pius column base, etc. The iconography is always identically the exact same, right? The hero on the chariot, carried by the horse, of course, and the heavenly glory, the winged glory, that is actually, as we've seen, the same transfigured spirit of the warrior himself leading the way, right, through providence and divine grace. Sacrificed horses serve their master in his new heavenly abode, where he belongs, where he's simply returning to, given his divine nature. And yet the symbol is always dual, because you can succeed, right? Remember Plato's Biga, you have the white horse, the heavenly one that pulls up, right, and the chthonic, dark one that pushes down. And you have to counterbalance that. You can't really, in fact, in the Triumph, it's always white horses, because the idea that also the black one has been transfigured by the hero, right? But Hades, for example, Iliad 5:654 and 15:445-46, and the Aeneid 6:656, is referred to as famous for his charioteers, right, as Lord of the Underworld. Why? Because many failing charioteers ended up actually not transfiguring, but failing, and so you would have so many of them piling up in the underworld, not having made it to reach the firmament. I will not digress now. I made a video about the actual doctrine of the three souls and how, what is that also goes to hell to a degree, even when the primary soul may have actually achieved a place in the firmament, as we will see now, and maintaining this connection with the underworld as well. This is also why there were those aforementioned tendentially superstitious practices by saying, okay, let's just stick to the mortal remains. Think about the Kurgans or the mounds of the Irish heroes that eventually were sanctified in the age of Christianity, because it was literally believed that in this mound even the decomposition would bring to a sort of permeation of this tumulus, to a degree that even though in the lower somatic element would be increasing by literal contact, the individual who was meditating, was praying in those mounds as in an ascetic fashion to augment at least his bodily and it's always also spiritual dimension, and even though taken at some point quite too much, especially among the fourth as status to many materialistic and deterministic characteristics. But, I mean, when the Iliad and the Aeneid tell you something, just remember you're talking about the master sources in this sort of racist hierarchy of sources, superiority and inferiority. Now, the horse is not a distinguishing feature of those who have ridden it in life, even, but necessarily at least, but rather an attribute of deceased individuals who are particularly noteworthy, right? In other words, the horse can be also seen as a vehicle for heroization. For example, Roman emperors were to horse ride habitually, and also in the parades, on campaign, and that was obvious. Nobody would have thought otherwise, but in a sense, of course, it's not like there were literally like feudal lords that would spend their entire life on horseback at the time anymore. But it was still believed that they must do that. And when they died, and you can see this for Roman magistrates, where, for example, they are depicted by the triumviri monetalis, their relatives, descendants, always as horsemen, defeating, like, a Gallic warrior on foot, or also severing his head, or even crushing other knights, as what the Roman hero actually was. And we have this since, like, when the denarius is around, like, and you can see that iconography. You have essentially the second, first century BC, providing you with even that sort of, in the so-called Republican period, which is also technically never existing, like in Roman mindset, it's just a contemporary historiographical convention, but where you had a more sort of egalitarian establishment at the top of the oligarchy. Well, you have so many different figures of those, not just like the emperors in the monarchic faith, in what we call the Imperial one, telling you really what the Romans saw themselves like. By the way, this sense that the horse is a vehicle for heroization is evident in areas where shamanic beliefs hold that the chosen one is transferred to the Empyrean, right? And this association was, for example, proper of Scythian shamanism. We'll have to take a look better at that religion, because it's not really shamanism is actually one of the lowest dimensions of the lowest dimension of the Imperial Catholic religion. You have all these guys now on the internet, look at shamanism, because these were kind of our ancestors. They were lesser people, right? If you know about them, it's because we have this also sense of barbarization of these populations by other peoples who were mastering the world at the time, and so these barbarians that, however, in their actual elites, instead had a much more Apollonian understanding of the world, right? And don't think, like, again, in all these mythologies, there isn't like a pre-Indo-European element popping up. Like, there are some things that are puzzling to a degree, but there really aren't. Like, if you understand it, it's not much like an oppositive dichotomy, but in an integrating one. For example, why were the Vestal virgins, like, women, to protect the sacred fire? Like, in other parts of the Indo-European world, like, this was just a male prerogative. But in a sense, the Romans also thought that the women were so pure that this could be achieved, as a matter of fact. And it's an incredibly high and solemn element that, however, does derive as well from the Pelasgian ethos, like in the Roman tradition, that is said heavily and as rigidly patriarchal, fatherly, and virile. Now, this sense, for example, this is important because you see, shamanism is not merely Dionysian frenzy, right? It does talk about the necessity to activate those senses in order to make the most of yourself, so that you can, as an initiatic step, think about the war bands, like the lowest elements are the canine, the wolf ones, right? And then the hero is a Bezots, is a guy who has providence, who is a cold, rational guy, fundamentally, that is able, again, to achieve just with his pure spiritual capacities that have surpassed, like, basically all these initial steps. In fact, even in that tradition, brings to heaven, Think about Tacitus Germans that have this connection with the horse that is somehow perceived as sacred, is studied, and it's meant to resonate that cosmic energy. This is the same reason why the steppe peoples, for example, have often these bells ringing on the horse trappings, because it's meant that, like, through the horse, like, the same cosmic power is manifesting and ringing with that impalpable reality that music can provide. Look at what the Khwarezmians, before the Mongol invasion, among the most straightforward heirs of the once Indo-European ruled steppe, like, they have an actual drum carried on a chariot with smaller drums all around. The bigger one is in gold, and the smaller ones all around are played by the princes that are essentially hostages slash hosts at the Khwarezmian court from all the subjected populations, playing this great sound that is the manifestation of the Holy Ghost, right, in the world. And that literally drills the army into combat, because that's what the drum does, right? And that's actually a Dionysian instrument, but again, I made some videos about Islamic military music. We will come back on that as well to explain it better. But it wasn't different from this Dionysian frenzy, like among the Scythians, among the Germans, that was meant to reactivate that taste for blood. And if you have doubts about this, please watch that video about the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle, because it tells you actually how these peoples at the margins of the more Apollonian religions, as they were also defined by great thinkers like Altheim as well, like Rome and Greece, were feeling in the outskirts, like we're feeling in the darkness, right? If you wonder why, I don't know, the Germans had the audience crowd, that's technically also still an ego, right? But the sense that they were the counter-cultural underdogs, that as literal wolves, they had to still emerge, like to take over the world, as that was notoriously ruled at that point by the Roman Empire, was actually informing their own means of, that warlikeness of during the migration era from tribal peoples had derived, of course, from this continuous activation of that, what the Romans called furor, that actually was the same virtus in the very archaic meaning of the term in their Latin ancestry, from the very Indo-European times, together with audacia, for example. There was the ferg. There were lots of terms throughout all the Indo-European vocabulary. I made a video on that too, if you're interested. The Indo-European sacred furor, that's one of the first videos I ever made on these topics back in the day. And what is interesting is that even the lowest form of activation of this divine power in shamanism is reflected in the highest solemn Platonic symbolism and in the funerary Pegasus from the Hellenic culture. And beyond, right? There are other, even sort of very chtonically influenced currents within, for example, the Hellenistic world that still recognize this Empyrean space that the horseman achieves in the firmament as a consequence of his apotheosis. From the heroized deceased to the knight chevalier, there is only a simple step, and actually a fil rouge threading, like this continuum, as a matter of fact, throughout the millennia. And so you understand how we've been obnubilated and obfuscated by this sort of weird, strange, empty view of history, scanning eras with different, strange ideologies coming out of nowhere, allegedly. It was always the same identical thing, always. And everybody knew that at the time, which is also part of the reason why nobody actually explains it to you in an explicit way. But from the comparative study of Indo-European languages, religions, etc., it's always the same identical thing, right? And actually, from this heroized deceased, the knight chevalier, it is easy to reach the god chevalier, because at the end of the day, who are heroes, right? They are these guys who actually will contribute in the clash in end time, because they have earned their place in heaven, and where they are training, like in the Valhalla, for eternity, in order to serve God in the final struggle, because they have been worthy of partaking his ranks, right? Through their own getting it, through self-sacrifice in holy combat. And these guys remain literally in the firmament. I mean, literally the constellations, the various mythological figures are meant to reflect these actual heroes that won that place. And every culture has its own. So the hero is not just, yes, in a sense, the guy who sort of had fallen from divinity as humanity, but that sort of, remained at a certain height, and then we sort of gradually degenerated from, right? It's also a guy that is especially a guy who is able to invert the trend, right? And so you can't really distinguish these magnificent warlords that would have been considered, say, I don't know, in Homeric Greece, like raiding our coastland from their ships that were considered as horses, and that had also, that's the Poseidonic connection there, as demigods, right? In a Dendra panoply, for example, that would have basically obnubilated your own senses. You would have almost passed out through it, but they had in fact the titanic psychophysical capacity to master as an actual master race. They were different. The concept of purity and nobility of blood stemmed from that and from selection into combat. And remember, it's not just enough to die in combat. You have to actually win, or to achieve so much beyond yourself to win a place in heaven. The others go under, right, and stay there. Those that God does not favor. And so there is a liminal, of course, as gradual loss in hope that corresponds to the nature of warfare, and how the warrior can essentially transcend himself by killing someone that is bigger than him, so winning that real difference that demonstrates he has augmented himself. But there is also the bloodshed, and you have to live upon this. You have to be able to capitalize on this achievement, right? Taking on the same slain warrior power, but at the same time, it's a big metaphor for having slain the dragon within you, and so having augmented yourself to an incredible degree. But it's not really separated, because that does pass through this combat, sacrifice. That's where the spoliopium in the Roman tradition actually stems from, as a sacrifice, as literally the panoply, or even actually the corpse of the slain enemy was brought as a sacrificial victim, as a gift to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. That's what the triumph was initially about as well. Now, the warrior on horseback who chases and destroys an antagonist, personifying evil forces, becomes familiar in Mediterranean culture. Right? Again, these evil forces are still provided by some divine power. The Indo-European hero never sort of dismisses them, but has to find ways to fundamentally tackle them, because he must be that superior not to even, realize what their ethics can be. It's just like, sort of later, it's a more elaborated context, metaphorically speaking, what Perseus does with Medusa, for example. It is clear that in this context, the horse no longer has any connection to its chthonic functions. Instead, it plays a positive role in a dualistic discourse, or at least in a dual discourse, meaning that when the Indo-Europeans arrive, their own war horses, the relation to these masters now that come to dominate is where they take it over, they overwhelm it, are necessarily considered as, again, like the potential, the inherent potential a bit like in quantum physics, like that God has set at the root of reality in order for allowing you to turn this back to the original unity. So the horse can go in a direction or another, but it's you who has to master that, right? This is the horse, of course, was this gigantic beast that was somehow titanic in force and surpassing even the one of so many humans in actual value, in actual work. Especially when it was won with a hero, right? Famously enough, like the great trainers of the time, think Achilles with the centaur, etc., always refer to essentially, we were these centaurs. But obviously so, they were knights, right? They were men who lived like they were all one with the horse, essentially, for how professionally, as divinely invested in warfare they really were. The figure on horseback, armed and overpowering a monster, becomes thus the symbol of victory over death itself. Hence St. George and the dragon, the entire Christian symbology of crushing the snake, and this again coming from way before, where death should be understood in its broadest sense, including the spiritual aspects, right? Death is that point. There is no beyond. You have had your shot, you've not been able to win immortality, so you are fully mortal and you're gone, right? There may be a hope that somebody in your community, in the world, will manage to bring everything back, but again, the pile of dead accumulates, and gradually again the hope that this can be achieved also is universally forgotten, or at least lost. By the 3rd century BC, the knight chevalier has become popular in Macedonian colonies of Ptolemaic Egypt, such as Fayum, the famous Fayum. This is recorded by Plutarch, right? This was not a previous thing, right? There were other symbolisms, as we will see now, also in Egypt, right? This is not a uniquely Indo-European thing, but the Indo-Europeans are the ones who literally spread equestrian warfare since the beginning. And so you see, after Alexander's conquest, the equestrian symbolism spreading even more far and wide. We consider again just the Scythians, the brute knights, and the Macedonians kind of a person next door that they were kind of a monarchy, but they were kind of Greeks, right? So they voted, they were like us, they didn't care so much about religion, because we don't either. These people's exclusive meaning in existence was conquering the world on horseback. The only one, and if you were not part of it, you were just a lesser human being that deserved to be ruled over. All right. The Masons, again, the purest, most brutally and traumatically shocking feudal culture in sedentary Europe at the time, literally winning, breaking with this hammer, together with the anvil of the chthonic phalanges that are necessary for that transfiguration, but lording over them as kings, as monarchs, as kings of kings, when they take over the same Achaemenid empire that had played their role itself. Remember, the Achaemenids, the Medians, had sprung out of the Indo-European steppes, and they had been cultivating that equestrian culture themselves, together with their royalty and Catholic rule since the beginning. So, indeed, with Alexander, there is a further spread of the equestrian symbolism. I mean, his father was called Philip, so you know what Philip means, right? It means like veritable lover of horses, this friend of horses, someone who has an affinity with the war horse. That is the key to divine transfiguration. And so all this equestrian iconography can be traced in turn from this Hellenic framework of equestrian heroization that was expanding throughout the Mediterranean basin by this time, especially like the Macedonian conquest that, again, took this immense step that nobody had really even thought could be taken before this point. In Egypt, these images were introduced by the Macedonian mercenaries of the Ptolemaic dynasty and soon became assimilated into the same Egyptian mythology's story, specifically the one of Horus defeating Seth. So again, the Saint George there is there. It's been noted that from Horus' knight, right, dressed in military attire and armed, who strikes down Seth the crocodile, would eventually develop the iconography of Coptic saints. I'm preparing a video about Christian African warfare, the African horn, like between the 11th to 14th century. And if you think about it in perspective, yes, that was a thing, right? There was, of course, a universal symbolism flowing in the same St. George, like the Byzantine iconography, but before that, the same Hellenistic one, the Macedonian, and even in that African case, the Egyptian one, in turn derived from Greece in Ptolemaic times. Hellenistic times, they are definitely very interesting. Like, one notes that across much of the Mediterranean basin, there was, at this point in history, an evolution, a veritable evolution of both iconographic types and religious ideas. There was a new confidence that had been spread by Alexander's Evangelion. He had truly won immortality. That's why, famously enough, when Octavian crushed finally Antony and Cleopatra, goes to Alexandria, and the first thing he does is visiting Alexander's tomb. And when his companions suggest him to visit Ptolemy's tomb, Octavian would be Augustus Sebastos. Remember the etymology there, augere, to increase, to elevate divinely, says, no, I'm here to visit the living, not the dead. Meaning that, of course, in his coffin, Alexander was alive. In eternity, Alexander was alive. He had achieved heaven, and he was truly living. Namely, you have this appearance of god knights accompanied by monstrous and evil animals at the same time that they vanquish. As we've seen here, Horus the crocodile, Cacus the snake, or the boar for the Thrace. These are not random symbols because they, as we've seen, represent sort of the evil nature within, but they also speak of, let's say, a more chthonic dimension that is truly depository of some, in fact, telluric forces that are necessary in order to be elevated. Right? For example, the boar is a symbol, as you know, of the priesthood itself, of this connection of the more contemplative element with the indoctrination that is necessary for the hero to win, and that, in fact, is always taken care of because it's a force that is agitating underneath, like the Apollonian dimension, on which that this has to use in order to reinforce itself. The Romans, for example, were always very respectful of the Etruscan Aruspicina, because in spite of coming from that more Pelasgian lunar dimension, was thought to be very powerful, very sinister, and that force, right, from that land of kings, priests, was to be always consulted by these Apollonian consular oligarchs, patricians, that were to embody like the surpassing of that same, the lording over, the use, the command over that force that could be launched against the same enemy, just like in the Devoto, where before storming a city, like the Romans asked the local deities to pass from Roman side, but they would have been preserved under augmenting the force of the same Rome, otherwise threatening literally the canceling from the face of the earth by the same Rome. in case of resistance. This is a beautiful idea, and it was a real deal that was negotiated before the battles. The weapons with which these monstrous and evil animals are killed or slain often reference solar worship. For example, Horus lance, Cacus club, Zeus Dolicanus, or Apollo's double axe. Right? We have to make a bit about the Fasces Lictoriae, the Lictorian symbolism in the Roman Indo-European tradition. Right? So probably the Indo-European double-headed axe that represent that sense of power in unity and in striking capacity. It's Thor's hammer, as a matter of fact. And in fact, it emerges, again, always from the same identical Drachenkampf, in this case. You see, for example, in the Balkans, in the Danubian region, this, in fact, so-called Danubian plagues, rendered to us by archaeology. These are small figurine plates found in graves from Pannonia to Thracia. One sees again the theme of a sun god armed with a double axe crushing a monster under his horse's hooves. Right? This is always again returning. The double axe representing this divinely achieved power through virtus, integrity, inflexibility, perennial display of virility, crushing this telluric Pelasgian monster under probably even the hooves of the horse, that is transfigured, of course, by the same night. The origin of these small plagues, linked to the world of the dead through their discovery in tombs, as you understand, is likely attributed to autochthonous Dacian cults. However, considering that ancient Dacian religion was aniconic, it is probable that the emergence of iconographic types was influenced by Thracian and perhaps Hellenic cultures, particularly those related to the cult of the Dioscuri. This latter aspect is very interesting. You know how important the Dioscuri really were in Hellenic tradition, in the Roman one, Castor, Pollux. The same Mithras was one of the Dioscuri from essentially the Vedic tradition, filtered also through Iran. And of course, the Dioscuri represent the doctrine of the two natures, because essentially they're son of the same father, but one is a proper god because is generated with a goddess. The other is instead a hero, at least. He's mortal, let's put it in this way, because it was generated with a woman. And the sense is that these twins, this you find also, I don't know, in the Germanic tradition with Vinil and Vandil, that are also like the forefathers, respectively, of the Longobards and the Vandals, the Vinili and Vandals. In fact, that's the point. You find them all across, again, European tradition, and they signify the necessity of the cooperation between the two natures. I mean, the fact that there is no hypostatic separation between the two, as actually like this sense that, you know, the word was degenerating, so the impossibility from the lower human one to access the divine one through these activities as well. So keeping alive that bond, keeping alive that bridge, right? Remember the pontifex, right? It's sacred royalty. What these leaders had to do, bridge like the two natures and remain in between, and the horse was the actual bridge together with that, because it was so powerfully both heavenly and earthly, right, in nature. And the necessity of this diet right? To always correspond with one another. I mean, the human dimension, like mirroring the divine, wants to elevate itself and return to that. Now, these figures undoubtedly had, for this reason, a soteriological apotropaic essence. In other words, from one side, they were mirroring all those practices that the various warriors in their youth underwent in order, like as initiatic rites in this war bands, to be elevated to these higher levels. But also there was that level of scaramantic superstition, the idea that these plagues will defend me because with this precious metal there is essentially what we were saying before regarding the Saint Kurgans, like that sort of shield, that protection, that at least recognition in combat that God will see when I will display it in the fray. And then there is also thus tutelary or talismanic meaning for also the soldiers following the leaders, right, in war, or for the deceased on their perilous journey through death and towards an afterlife that had to hopefully again be regardless of this, more the souls of the ancestors. Given that, as we were hinting at before, for the doctrine of the three souls, there is one soul that goes basically with what we understand as earthly life, or at least the one of the person. Then there is a soul that basically reverts to the chthonic dimension and to the totem of the ancestors. So this is exactly the one that, together with the bodily remains, will go underground, unless again the path of cremation is chosen to, in that sense, also mimic the actual and full bodily transfiguration. If anything, there are still the ashes carried away there, and in fact also buried. So you see all this gradual degradation from what was believed to initially instead happen for the victorious hero. And so these plagues would go together, like with this precious materials of divine origin to enrich that totem. Whereas hopefully the actual life, the actual soul of the deceased, the most important one at least, will have hopefully transcended rather than essentially dissolving after death and not making it to the sky after a while after the death, right? Now, it is evident that these various symbolisms share similarities and betray a common typical substratum. Notice, for example, how rather than depicting combat, the iconographic theme refers to hunting. The likelihood is that such theme refers mostly to a psychomachia of sort, like the idea that the warrior does not really have to fight against an alter ego. In other words, there is no dualistic heresy whereby there is a counter force opposite to God that humanity also would simply be in between without understanding exactly what to do. But there is a vertical separation between those who are ahead and must remain ahead in that divine order, and those who remain below by deriving force. I mean, the former deriving force from the latter, and as an inner clash, right? A way of life, of cultivation. Naturally, this is historically determined. Like the art, the way it was now mirrored, it was not necessarily as purely doctrinal or original in the belief. But we notice this familiar theme, right? For example, as late as the 3rd century AD, with the triumph of the Sasanian Empire and the resulting revitalization of Mazdaism, because the Sasanians, as you know, were to essentially re-establish the grandeur of the Achaemenid Empire, differently from your Sassanids that had sort of a slightly different mentality. The image of Mithras' knight also spread, under which the opponent, Ahriman, succumbs. And in the myth realm of Dura-Europos, Mithras is portrayed as a horseback hunter. There were different sensitivities between these cultures. At a point we will look at the Iranian tradition better in some other video, but the hunting motive, which is the same one of, again, St. George and the Dragon that remains alive throughout all our culture, springs out exactly from an iconographic point of view, an artistic point of view at this point, right? You can't already enucleate that. And by the way, around the horse, a veritable religious koine has been created since the arrival of the Reitervölker in the Pontic-Caucasian world from Iran to the Mediterranean basin. We're talking about the proper Indo-European invasions, not the migration here, which is yet another cycle of the same dynamic. The extreme west of Europe was not immune either to this influence. And in fact, even there, the horse and divine horsemen appeared in the soteriological apotropaic framework of the conqueror of dark forces for one purpose of guarantor of immortality beyond death for another. This is relevant because, as you know, for example, the war chariot spreads as far as Ireland, as Spain, right? These areas are the more distant from the Indo-European spring or source, but they're gradually Indo-Europeized. And you know that in these cultures, not just you have, I don't know, the Iberians were not Indo-Europeans. Even in the Gaelic tradition, you see this very prepotent chthonic force. Think about the Morrigan. Think about like this again. This is in part true for Northern Europe as a whole. In the Germano-Norse sagas of darkness, like the incumbent sense of doom, right, of demise, and so this stems both from the places, but also for the more gradual and more initially rarefied Indo-European presence that sometimes affirm itself also in a much more violent way because of this perpetual clash in these fringe areas. This is very relevant in informing the later respective local approaches to tradition. However, the motives, the symbols, the ideas, the doctrines are always the same. In the Gallic goddess Epona, protector of horses and stables, we see an aspect of this group of beliefs characterized by equestrian heroization and representation of the initiatory journey of the deceased towards their ultimate abode. Even Gaul, we've seen it, was not actually this explosion of Indo-Europeanism. Most Indo-Europeans had settled to a large degree in the West, also in Central Europe, around the Alps, gradually sending those waves that also the Celtic invasions correspond to. And Gaul was very florid. There were lots of sort of pre-Indo-European peoples, and they gradually merged into the conquerors. And Epona, for example, is a female deity, which is also something you want to bear in mind because it wasn't quite the case for the other traditions. Yes, admittedly, you have the Amazons in the East, and there we must absolutely make sort of different videos on the topic, but it doesn't actually mean, again, that the Scythian tradition was sort of, more inclined to that sort of gynecocratic or even remotely, in fact, feministic orientation. It's also a lot about how the Greeks represented the Scythians, and indeed also how those peoples had their own problems regarding controlling like various territories, having to negotiate through the lack, for example, of a permanent territorial state like the local. Also, because they weren't just nomads in the steppes, like these local communities had influences, of course, in their practice as well. In any case, equestrian heroization has a prominent place in Celtic religiosity. right, which is characterized by worship of ancestors turned into gods. Coquelin had a lot of connections with, as you know, with horsemanship as well. So all these heroes always revolve around their equestrian skills as fully accomplished gods at the end of the day. Around Roman times, alongside the female goddess protecting horses, because Epona was eventually also absorbed in the Roman set, as we've seen before, of conquering deities, the solar knight began to appear, right? Towards the Mediterranean, you have, again, the more victorious Indo-Europeans of all, like those who had grabbed the best land, who had this greater power to wield. Like, they're much more solar, Apollonian in nature. And, as you know, this godfather is armed with lightning and slaying a serpent. This is true actually also in the Norse tradition, as you know, which is in fact actually closer to the spring, like it managed to reinforce itself, not to be so tonic as the also sort of more confused Celtic one really was, in part also because the Romans and the Germans conquered the Celtic world as a whole, so that didn't help, unfortunately. But we understand that they were sharing basically the same beliefs, again, but to a different intensity that corresponded, in fact, also to their different degree of military prowess. But the thunder god, right, the godfather per excellence, slaying the dragon, the snake, right, this is a major theme. Dating, or at least like we can trace this in a formal sense to the Iron Age, but we understand that they were much older, soon merging with those that we have seen of mystical hunting, that is, the knight slaying a monster, this soteriological and again psychomagical theme, and thus transformed later into Christian iconography, as we very well know. This process is evident, especially in countries like, for example, the Iberian Peninsula, where, interestingly enough, the cult of the Dioscuri flourished, right? Although fundamental studies have dispelled the legend of the Dioscurian origin, at least of part of Iberian spirituality. Remember, these weren't technically even Indo-Europeans, but as you know, many Celts were pouring in. Then the Romans arrived. The knight and his horse passed thus from being symbols of spiritual salvation to being protective figures in general. This is more in tune, again, with that gradual sort of alienation of the masses from the exercise of arms, the general aging of the world. That's also why you have, again, that medieval reality after the collapse of the empire, at least its dramatic shrinking, where you need this ever more loaded, at this point, newly feudal knights that defend and protect this often, let's say, defenseless people, at least majority-wise, right? Instead, in the ancient world, this was very well known, as long as most, at least Indo-European populations, were militarized, right? And these general symbols were known to all. Then, if you look at the Middle Ages, it's what we call this age of, at least in the Dark Age, Black Legend, like a word of superstition, where people were sort of more pathetic, sensual, and therefore just mostly subjecting themselves to this messianic, eschatological, and but still entrusting their souls to these higher authorities. And unfortunately, from those masses, eventually modern, contemporary people came from. So having today forgotten that this was sort of the universal belief up to not such a long time ago, and still, I don't know, in the Middle Ages, countering a bit that narrative from a factorial point of view, like, we understand that people actually knew what that symbol actually was, right? Also in the modern age, it's rather in the contemporary era that basically the ultimate meaning was lost, even though we have very well reconstructed it, studied it, researched it, written about it, but people prefer watching smartphones all the day long. That's the difference. The relationship with death cults automatically connected the Dioscuro, the god knight, with fertility rites as well. Again, it's the day, it's the god of thunder and rain, etc., that inseminates the land, and so really renders it, transfigures it, as we were saying before. It makes it a participant of that divine grace, saves it, right? Allows life to spread from that and to reach the sky again. And this is really seen in customs related to solstice festivals, from which also some of our major holidays today stem from. They celebrated, in fact, the same thing. In fact, the same aforementioned Sol Invictus and the triumph of light over darkness. But these are very, very important, meaningful events. Now, from companion to the dead, to colleague in repressing evil conducted by solar gods, the horse thus becomes a friend and protector of humans. Remember Philippos in Hellenic. Like horse bones defending the deceased, the horse's skull defends houses and crops in folk traditions. You've seen it very often, like you can find it in Berber, Italian, German cultures. That's always the same symbol, right? The horse maintains that power. It's a bit like the G's, right? Think about the Lohengrin, the northern conqueror that flies from, the perennial, essentially, sea that remolds, again, like the Romans on their Liburnae, reconquering the fat female south of Egypt and reuniting like this Middle Earth right into this explosion of Catholic imperial power. So it's possible that the magical value of equine skulls, you find really many cultures, like also the Magyars and etc., which was already an apotropic symbol in antiquity, but was later degraded to an ornamental motive, depends on very old sacrifices where the horses had their heads and hooves cut off. Hence, probably in this that common folklore, the idea that dead souls ride animal cripples and decapitated animals. Remember that, because this was, I know that most of you would have never heard of that, but this is actually the case. It's a bit like the legend of the beheaded knight, except in this case it's also the horse, right? Where does that stem from in European folklore? Well, look around and look at those symbols and realize what happened to these animals and why. Where this power was consider that the same was done with a slain enemy. They were beheaded and skull caps were created out of their heads. So this was the same with horses. There was so much power, I've seen a divine one, in these massive beasts that just the other day in the video about 12th century knightly warfare, we were observing how specifically selected they were, being hyper testosterone loaded studs capable of smashing into literally anything, being massive beasts. Like, they weren't even have to be particularly tall, but they were beefy like hell, right? And so they were, of course, incredibly expansive, and you wouldn't really like. Remember, the horse is the alter ego of the knight, together with the sword as well. We talked often about this, so you can't really okay, this horse dies and who cares? Like, it's like, again, think about Alexander with Bucephalus, as we were saying before. What a deep love. That's why Hippos Philia from Philip in Macedonian tradition stems from. Like, what kind of affinity, what kind of dyadic harmony existed between the horse hero and his horse. It's very moving, because really war horses are that intelligent. They know exactly what they have to do, and there can't be a good cavalry with, let's say, a bad horse in a good rider and vice versa. They must understand each other immediately, and they must be ready to sacrifice their own life in the ultimate proof that is the charge against the enemy. And that is really the greatest moment of glory that any person can ever inspire to hopefully transcend into. And really, it requires that's what I always say. Like you say, oh, cavalry charge. Do you have the faintest idea what it means to throw yourself at 45 kilometers per hour canter? That is more or less the speed which cavalry charge. Some would charge, of course, at full gallop, but that depended, which means, I don't know, multiply that for the enemy that arrives at the same speed against you, smashing to something at 90 kilometers per hour. Do you realize what it means? Do you realize what kind of mentality you must need in order to do that? Do you even picture that? Do you realize how megalopsychic a person must be in order to be able to afford to fight under this precondition? You can't be a lesser person. You can't be a psycho-physically feeble. You must be something beyond a normal human being. And this is what true divinity, as at least the first step towards it, really means. Like the entirety of warfare was molded on to begin with, right? Because this can be, of course, surpassed in history eventually, when, as we've seen, among these very peoples, infantry was more important. When, let's say, warfare adapted to many different civilizational developments, but the concept of sacrificing yourself in that way, still, however, with the hope of winning, because who is from the opposite side can break in the same exact way. And so it's really about how truly strong you are. It's really the essence of strategy. It's really the essence of in fact, the Indo-European doctrine of struggle and victory that allowed us to be. Remember this. Without these people, you wouldn't be. In any case, because the world was dominated and molded by the Europeans. There is no way around that, whoever you are. Right? So, this preeminence is literally what made these men heroes, knights and gods. Boccaccio in the 14th century remembers that a donkey's skull guarded a vineyard belonging to Lotharingi near Fiesole. Right, this is sort of course, part of a jokey context. Right, in fact, it highlights how it was understood still at the time of the Decameron. This is in Book 7. Of course, the horse was the true meaning of it all, and so this detail remains magical despite its burlesque context, right? To say that still in 14th century Italy, you had the sense that the skull of a horse was perceived as truly powerful and truly connected with a higher sense of knighthood, what men-at-arms were mastering at the time. And this is true. Like, we made a video about the condottieri that sort of shows how powerful, especially by that time, it had been the 14th century. As you know, there is a refeudalization of warfare, right? And so also further professionalization and elitization of warfare, whereby men-at-arms are ever more performing, also in a technical, qualitative, powerful sense. So it's not just a random note. It's not just like, okay, Boccaccio's times were pretty far from antiquity, right? So it's Europeans still believed this. Also in such a highly sort of secular modern reality like communal Italy, right? But we've seen also in our series about Florence how important, in fact, the men-at-arms were for the houses of Florence in the general knightly behavior that the patriciate really had and kept cultivating themselves. Passing to the other side of Europe, we have an Icelandic parallel with marked similarities to Scythian funerary customs. This stems from the Vatnsdal saga. Even auguries related to horses are not always negative at all. On the contrary, there exists an entire positive spectrum that derives again from the nobility of these animals in medieval tradition. And so you have a legacy continuing here. Like the Icelandic Scythian connection is very important because, as you've seen in the video about medieval English warfare, still by the 11th century, like the connection, for example, between Ruthenia and the Anglo-Saxons via Scandinavia in the late Viking era was still very strong. And so many also steppe influences are to be found in places, as you know, like Sweden in the early Middle Ages. And again, we're so close in time and in space to the same migration era there. And so when you look at medieval knights and make videos about them, think about this. Think about what's behind that. And the other day, a guy commenting on, I make the statements because as a proof of the fact that even if I censor comments, I still talk about them and just don't want other mentally deranged people to capitalize on them. I was talking about 12th century knights and saying exactly this, that of course behind knighthood was a traditional sense of devotion. Of course, in the 12th century, still all knights across Europe were in brotherhoods of warriors. They called themselves after, I don't know, the Arthurian knights or the Company of the Wolf, things like this, also in very sort of urban context, for example. And they were all getting through this initiatic rites before entering. And of course, I was saying that the ultimate purpose of the knight was this old transfiguration, this apotheosis in combat. And this guy says, the guy is mixing that. He's saying that the holy warriors were just, the knights were holy, just the crusaders. But aside from the fact that the crusaders were actually the same knights that went on the crusade, would come back home, the guy actually, the literate guy meant the monastic military orders, which were the pure, straightforward continuity of this sense of knighthood that was sort of re-perfecting during the 12th century Renaissance with Bernard of Clairvaux, etc. But I understand that phrenastony and cerebral shortcomings, it's difficult to even realize that, again, there was a concept of sanctity in the Cingulum Militaris, and that when you became a knight, you were a holy warrior that had to serve God in that transcendental fashion. Like, if you don't know that, how can you read Chrétien de Troyes, the Arthurian legion? For example, among insular Celts, last example, horses were subject to many taboos, but also candidates for royal dignity were assimilated into a white horse, famously enough, which they ate meat from. So clearly incorporating its virtues through a rite common among traditional cultures. As we saw before, also drinking from an enemy skull, literally making your own, constitutively your own, that divine power was thought to be inherent this being, right? And so that by slaying you would become the same. Remember, there is also that video about the Germanic adoptio per arma that is quite relevant, because there is especially that episode from Paul the Diacon when Alboin slays the son, the prince, of the Gepids, and takes his own seat at the table of the Gepidic king, because that was a custom. Like when you killed, there was a very retributive sense of reality. Like you killed that guy, you were better than him. So his father would adopt you because you were better than his son. And even in that, like Paul the Diacon says, of course, that the father was sad, whatever, but it was common practice still by the 6th century to think like that. And was there also an equine metaphor, but it kind of eludes this topic, if anything, just because it refers to an insult that you find also in the Norse sagas regarding essentially being a mare, probably just like a normal insult. Then there are hypotheses why the Gepids would say that to the Longobards, but it's likely just a general accusation of cowardice. And the guy says, well, you've seen how this mare could kick the bones of your brother on the, on the field of battle. This was the brother of the prince that had been killed, and everybody passes to the swords, and the wise Gepid king says, "Quiet down, because this guy has actually kicked our ass." So, he knows better, right? So it's a great proof of what these people believed in, and you see in a way that it's very close to us. First of all, it's just 1,500 years ago, even less, and this is what habitually, just like the Longobards that had mostly dwelled into Central Europe at that point, simply and obviously believed. So for an 8th century, 9th century priest like Paul the Diacon, was a Longobard himself from one of the more traditional Longobard eras, but normally just very sort of attenuating, let's put it in this way, the original meaning of this practice, was recognizing, because it's not like when he was at the court of Charlemagne, as he was like the Carolingian paladins believed in particularly different things from those ones, especially considering that they were not priests. So there was, like, it's self-evident that there was an esoteric knightly culture and training dating back to this ancient practice throughout all, can't even say when it actually ended, right? It probably died with the Ancien Regime in many ways, because that's sort of the most straightforward, both for the decline that it had already undergone and the fact it was removed, right, from the equation at large. Like, we understand that was the moment in which it was really forgotten to a degree, but we easily understand, of course, through some these sources like the ones we've seen today, for example, but also the same, what we know about how these guys train, for example, the kind of education they received, and sort of what immense skill was needed to really live like this. Because you see, people lived like this. It's not like today, like you have a soldier that stays at the front line for a total of 40 days, scattered throughout a longer time, and then gets back into the rear lines to be an instructor, right? These people lived their entire lives in this way. Do you understand what this practically means? Just from a neurophysiological point of view. It's a completely different way of experiencing existence. And the sense, of course, is that this experience would allow you to reach, as we've seen, a beyond, right? Something that was the ultimate goal of all this, for also a collective sake, right, of common salvation. This is incredibly relevant, and I can't stress how much enough. Naturally, we will keep talking about this topic. It's not the first time I have a video series, actually a playlist about war horse, or at least I want to create one. This goes straight into that. But yes, there is the medieval knighthood playlist, especially, that contains all these videos, and I think that step by step we're going to essentially reconnect all of this, because this is among probably my best content, at least it's among the most interesting but medieval knighthood. Yeah, we have my 63 videos. Oh, now it changed from videos to episodes. This is very interesting. Well, that's actually a lot. I thought less. Very good. Right, many are also old videos I haven't re-uploaded, but the ones we uploaded here are actually pretty good, are actually pretty interesting, and that's really what we're looking as an obvious need here for explaining this further. So again, it even gets a pretty large amount of views compared to other playlists, so that's good. But we have to revive the channel. Like we must do more, right? We must do much more. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.